I'm making a game inspired by Mario Kart, Ski Free, and Lonely Mountains Downhill. Welcome to Devlog 2. So the task I set out for the second month of development was to add Mario Kart style items to the game because I want to have a lot of time to iterate on and playtest them. Really, I'd like to create more than I need and only keep the most interesting ones. But there were a couple of things I had to do beforehand. First of all, I needed a bigger map. The slope I created for the first devlog was a decent proof of concept, but was really way too short and way too narrow to do any real multiplayer testing. I looked around at different world building tools and ended up using this application called World Machine. I didn't feel like spending a week learning everything about this tool, so I just took some of the example settings, moved things around a bit, and said, yeah, that looks pretty decent. After a few colorful import issues, I got the landscape working in Unreal. The color map that I exported from World Machine made it look a little too Skyrim, so I ended up using a constant base color for the rock and snow materials. Then I applied flat shaded normals to the landscape to give it that low poly look. For those who aren't aware, smooth shading is a way of imitating smooth surfaces on a 3D model without requiring millions of polygons, whereas with flat shading, we'll be able to more clearly see the individual polygons in the mesh. Using flat shaded normals on the landscape gives it that low poly look, but looks somewhat out of place on the snow, so I ended up removing it from the snow layer, and I like how the combination of smooth and flat shading looks here. But the mountains were still too round looking, so I added some random height offsets to each vertex in the cliff material to give it a bumpier look. Of course, this took some dialing in, but eventually I found something I liked, and I think this will serve as a decent starting point. One other thing about applying the random height offsets in the landscape material is that it makes manual edits really easy. I can just paint snow or rock layers onto any part of the landscape and the bump offsets and shading type is applied immediately. After adding a few other small details, I had my first test run on the new slope. At this point, I excitedly ran to my roommate Nick's room and politely asked him to playtest what I had so far. Then I had a very disappointing realization. As I watched him spin in circles, fly off cliffs, and discover new bugs, one thing became clear. The controls are confusing. The controls I had implemented and gotten used to were what I call character relative turn controls. With this setup, the character will always turn clockwise when the joystick is pushed right and counterclockwise when the joystick is pushed left. But when the character is facing the camera, these controls appear to be reversed since the turns are relative to the character's perspective. I think this control scheme does have some merit, but I also realize it's got a bit of a learning curve, so I instead decided to move to camera relative controls. Camera relative directional controls are much more standard in third-person games. This control scheme disregards character rotation and instead interprets joystick input relative to the camera position. So relative to what you see on the screen, the character will always turn to match the direction of the joystick. Lonely Mountains Downhill allows players to pick either one of these two control schemes, and that's something I might end up doing as well. So I went about implementing the camera relative control system. Unreal's character movement does come with this out of the box, but because I'm using this custom physics-based movement, I had to reinvent the wheel a bit. My linear algebra skills are mediocre at best, so there was a lot of trial and error involved, but eventually, after about a day and a half of fiddling around, I finally got something working. It was a night and day difference in my roommate's next playtest, and I was glad because I was feeling very ready to take a break from all this math. Next up, I laid out the camera follow path that I've been using for the on-rails camera system I talked about in Devlog 1. I also realized that multiplayer testing is really slow if others aren't willing to sit there and playtest with you for hours. And that's when I decided to build some AI characters to race against. I started by using Unreal's navigation mesh to guide AI movement. In this system, you give Unreal a volume and it determines the walkable areas and does all the pathfinding for you. You just tell your AI to go from point A to B and Unreal figures out all the rest. Testing this out, however, it was pretty clear that this is much better suited for walking or patrolling characters, and I'd be better off using some form of spline-based movement. And luckily, I had just finished setting up a spline that goes all the way down the track. The system I ended up using works by steering the AI character down the spline like this. On some given interval, we run the following steps. First, we get the nearest point on the spline to the player. Then, we move that point down the spline by some distance. Then, we apply force to the AI player in the direction of that point. Running this process over and over makes our AI character loosely follow the curves of the path. This required some fine-tuning, especially around the sharp turns where the AI's momentum would overpower the corrective path direction forces. My solution for this momentum problem was to add a look-ahead check that would attempt to reduce character speed if a projected future location takes the player off the path. This seemed to fix the issues and allowed me to crank up the speed on the AI characters as well. In an attempt to make the AI races feel less like a figure skating competition, I randomized some parameters that influence their movement to give them at least a little uniqueness. Though I had to be careful how much I randomized these values. Overall, it's still really basic, but it was enough to move on. And so, with my day as an AI ski instructor coming to an end, it was finally time to work on items. Introducing the first item, the Penguin Missile. So this item I imagined would work a lot like a shell in Mario Kart. I played around with having it simulate physics so they would fly off cliffs and bounce off things, but I ended up really liking how it looks when they spider their way up and down the mountain. So then I went into Blender and once again put my primitive modeling skills to the test, modeling a penguin off of this image an artist in my Discord had created. This is really just a placeholder model, but I need the practice and it sounded fun to work on. Also, I've got to give full credit for this idea to Gage. He suggested the penguin missile idea and I immediately became obsessed with it. I've got a number of ideas for upgrades or variants of the penguin missile, like a king penguin that can bolt through multiple skiers, or a squad of penguins that can fire in rapid succession. But for the prototype, I'll be keeping it simple. And of course, we've got to add some particle effects. And this was looking a lot better already, but as I suspected, it's really difficult to line up a shot when everyone's moving so quickly. So I went about adding a homing feature that causes the penguin to lock in on players when they fall within a target range. I played around with different shapes for the homing target and kept the implementation really simple. The penguin will only home in on a skier if they fall within the target range, and will lose focus if they manage to leave the target range. This gives players a narrow chance to escape after they've been targeted, which I think is a lot more interesting than a guaranteed hit. I also went back and added these little wing flapping animations. Again, this is just placeholder stuff, but I needed something to identify these little blue blobs as penguins. Before I started on the next item, I worked on making the rest of the map more playable. The model I had imported from World Machine had some really narrow areas, so I wanted to do some large-scale manual editing. I'd been putting this off for a while, but the result was a much more enjoyable and, I think, natural-looking course. Next up, I started work on the second item, the snow boulder. The snow boulder was one of the first items I thought of, and I spent a lot of time getting the movement just right. I wanted the snow boulder to not just knock over other players, but to pick them up as it rolled down the hill. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this part kicked my ass. I was attempting to glue the rolled over player to the snowball, and it seemed like every 10 minutes was a new bug, each somehow stranger than the last. This one was actually terrifying. I ended up avoiding the ragdoll physics altogether and instead just sucked up the player model into the snowball. I think there's a lot that can be done with this concept still. For instance, should the snowball explode after it expires? Should it get bigger and faster when it picks up other players? These are all things I hope to test in the playable demo, which I'd like to think isn't too far off. But there was one last item I wanted to get to this month, and that is Icy Trail. This was another one of the first item concepts, and I think it could be a pretty interesting mechanic. Icy Trail alters the terrain behind the player to create a slippery ice surface with the intention that it could be used defensively to send other players off the path. This is all footage of me iterating on the implementation of the Ice Trail visuals. Initially I had imagined a flat trail behind the player, but ended up really liking this effect where the trail appears as a bunch of growing shapes behind the player. I'm really excited about how this one turned out, and I think it could have some really cool interactions with other items. For example, should an icy trail cause a penguin missile to lose traction? Things like that. The last thing I did was teach the AI to use the items and set up slalom flags so that they would randomly assign items to players as they pass through. This is another mechanic that I'll be changing in the future, but I had a lot of fun testing all these item mechanics together against the AI players and having them bully me with penguin missiles. If you have any ideas for other items that should be in the game or just want to share your input, please feel free to leave a comment on the video and join the Discord. And if you're feeling generous, consider subscribing. Anyway, thanks for watching. Until next time.